Hello. I'm going to be doing a quick recap, of Japanese expansionism, so on and so forth from 1800s onwards, basically late 1800s. Oh, I might need a sip of water in between, but I think we're ready. Okay. So the Meiji Restoration, basically, Meiji Emperor, Meiji himself, ruled from 1867 to 1912. The Meiji Restoration begins perhaps with the promulgation of the first constitution of Japan in 1889. So, middle-class samurai overthrew the despotic Tokugawa shogunate in 1867, reinstating the emperor, making it official with the Charter Oath of 1868. So what was the shogunate? The shogunate was this not ruling, but this intermediary, one step below the emperor. They were feudal military dictators, also known as the Bakufu. They have been around since 1192, level number 92. Yeah. So, the Charter Oath of 1868 outlined where the nation was going to go after the Meiji Restoration, which was this massive economic modernization, rapid modernization of the country. So the Charter Oath of 1868, the Charter Oath of 1868 basically equalized the classes. It encouraged people to, abandon the hierarchy and to pursue jobs that they might like. To further the economy, to unite under the nation, and unite under the emperor. That was one of the main points of the Charter Oath. It reinstated natural law, because up until that point you had the Tokugawa shogunate, which wasn't natural at all to the people, because as far as they knew, the emperor was God. So for someone to forego God, there was no natural order left. So the Charter Oath restated natural law. It said the emperor is supreme, he's omnipotent, we are all under him, and you must unite as subjects, equal subjects under the emperor. So that's what the Charter Oath did. Now, economically speaking, the Meiji Restoration, it ended feudalism. What Japan wanted to do at that point was rapid modernization. They wanted to compete with the West, so they had to modernize super rapidly. They wanted economic independence, and they wanted national security from Western imperialism, which was taking over the world at the time. The economic growth averaged at 2.8% per year from 1885 to 1930, and there was an increase, the industrial output increased by 25% between 1895 and 1915 after the Meiji Restoration. There was also calls for, huge privatization with the Meiji regime. Politically speaking, you had these things called the zaibatsu. The zaibatsu were sort of these huge, monopolies, these huge companies, kind of like tables in Korea. They ran a monopoly. They were these large-scale industries which had been integrated into the economy. They were sort of, interlocked with the national economy. And that obviously gives them some line of power politically as well. Specifically in the Diet. So the Diet was Japan's parliament. It was Japan's form of a parliament, and it constituted of the House of Peers and the House of Representatives. So the zaibatsu had connections to, or were related to, 12% of the lower house, 28% of the upper house, and 22% of the House of Peers. So they ran pretty much monopoly, even politically speaking. Right. So, what Japan in the 1920s was domestically unstable. Why was this? So, first of all, you had the Wall Street crash in 1929, which greatly affected the economy, affected the world's economy. And secondly, because the Meiji Constitution failed to stabilize the economy in a longer term. While it was successful immediately, it helped modernize, it didn't have the foresight it needed. Okay, now moving on to further affairs. You had the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, which Japan attended. Japan hoped to consolidate German Pacific colonies to say, hey, we want rights over this. We think we should get rights over this after World War II. However, Japan was offended when the Western powers rejected their appeal for a racial equality clause. So what were Japan's gains from the World War I? Well, first of all, Japan declared war on and seized the German military base in the Shandong Peninsula in 1914. And then in 1915, Japan issued 21 demands. It's a pretty official declaration. Basically, this was issued to Yuan Shikai in China. What this basically gave Japan, it granted them extra commercial rights in Manchuria, it gave them rights to settle down there, and it also banned Manchuria from leasing coastal territory. So what this did really, this consolidation of German Pacific colonies, was that it proved to the world that Japan was an economic power in Asia. That again, this ties back into that racial inequality in the conference. Japan sort of, they wanted to stick up to them. They were going to be like, we deserve these rights. And that was their way of proving it. Now, if we look at how peaceful was Japan in the 1920s. So, in the 1920s, Shidehara Kijiro, who was the ambassador to Washington in 1921, and the foreign minister for Japan from 1924 to 1927, he put forth this policy, foreign policy of internationalism in the 1920s. He cut out, Japan's isolationism, and he was like, let's take a more conciliatory international approach. So they did. He was a signatory to several treaties, to the 4-Power Treaty in 1921, to the 9-Power Treaty in 1922, and the 5-Power Naval Treaty. Also, Japan at the time agreed to give back German concessions. So it was a very conciliatory, very pacifist approach that Japan took in the 1920s. It was quite peaceful. On quote, Taisho democracy and internationalism, never very robust to begin with, were probably doomed anyway, and were about to be 2 more victims of the world's depression. Well, 1993. And I think that just spells out what the next card's going to tell us. So what problems did Japan face in the 1920s? So first of all, Japan had a fragile democracy. There was a lot of fear of left-wing radicalism. There was also a violation of election regulation. There were so many Asians. This can be seen in the Peace Preservation Law, which Japan introduced to bar the Communist Party from participating in the government at the time. There was also a opposition to Shidehara's internationalism and growing military sentiments. Basically, a majority of the Japanese people believe that Shidehara's policies, or maybe just the government, the military government, they believed that Shidehara's policies were, they betrayed Japanese interests and that they needed a more aggressive foreign policy, especially in China. Third, the economic crisis. So obviously, Wall Street crashes, 1929. This spells disaster for Japan, right? Very new economy. For instance, a strike halts the docks in 1921. Again, you could link this back to like Dansk in Poland, but whatever. So now, interestingly enough, let's delve into the origins. Of nationalism and militarism, these sentiments in Japanese people. Why was it so popular at that particular time? So first of all, Japan wanted to transform into a Western-style power. Secondly, Japan believed in their destiny as a leader of Asia. Third, they wanted to obtain raw materials and to secure East Asian markets, to secure trade in East Asia. Fourth, they needed strategic security. Fifth, they were also influenced by Western actions. And last of all, sixth, just by popular support. It was just public demand at the time. Interestingly enough, in 1895, with the Triple Intervention, Germany, Britain, and Russia pressured Japan into returning Liaodong, which Russia later annexed. Sorry, did I say Britain? It's Germany, Russia, and France. Germany, Russia, and France, right? After winning the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894, a lot of these nationalist sentiments came up, and army and naval representatives were taken to be at the heart of the central government. Let's just keep going, right? Okay. So now we're going to move on to the Manchuria crisis of 1931. Before we do that, we must ask the question, why Manchuria? Why did Japan need to secure Manchuria? 4 reasons. Firstly, because Manchuria was agriculturally rich with mineral resources that Japan needed. Second, because it would act as a buffer for any external threats from Russia. Third, because the cordon of strategy and advantage had expanded due to Japan's annexation of Korea. And lastly, agriculture, Russia, cordon of strategy, it would provide living space for Japan's growing population. So the Manchurian crisis happens in 1931. So in 18 September 1931, the Kwantung Army goes against the commands that they had received. They blow up the railways, blow up the tracks, and they invade southern Manchuria. Interestingly enough, this happens because of a misdirection, because of a misalignment in the chain of command, and I'll tell you why. So, once the emperor heard about this back in Japan, he put out the non-expansion of hostilities, which basically ordered the Kwantung Army to pull back, to not go further into Manchuria. However, this letter was purposefully held back from the Kwantung Army, from the leaders of it, so that the Kwantung Army could invade Manchuria. So there was a lot of misalignment between, this was the government here, super conciliatory, but this was the military. They were aggressive with their expansion, and that pops up later on as well. So after this, Admiral Saito becomes the Prime Minister of the National Unity Cabinet, which again shows an increasing military influence in the government at the time. Okay, awesome. Not awesome, but yeah. Right, so seemingly to the outside world, Japan is violating the Washington Treaty. They are violating China's open door policy. They are violating the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Japan seems to be an enemy. They seem to be an expansionist threat that need to be isolated. They seem to not want international cooperation. Really, this is just, again, misdirection in the chain of command. Anyways, Manchuria is described as a lifeline and the only means of survival by Matsuoka, and Japan continued as before, contemptuous of the Chinese soldiers and the people, believing that they could easily be vanquished with a single strong blow. Bix 2000. So what was Japan's justification for invading Manchuria? Let me tell you something, it was gross. What do I mean by that? First of all, Japan wanted to establish its greatness. They wanted more resources. They wanted to secure their overseas market. They wanted space for settlements. And lastly, they wanted security. So, who is there to stop Japan? Who is there to take action? Well, at the time, there existed an organization called the League of Nations, which Japan was a part of. The League of Nations, let me tell you about it. The aims of the League of Nations was to stop war and to promote disarmament, right? Through the idea of collective security. It didn't work. The League of Nations didn't work. So after the Manchurian invasion, which violates Article 16 of the League of Nations Covenant, in September of 1931, which is when this event, after September of 1931, after the invasion, in December 1931, Lord Lytton is commissioned by the LON to investigate the matter. In April 1932, Lord Lytton visits Manchuria, and in December 1932, he announces that Japan needs to leave Manchuria, that their intentions were clearly expansionist. However, the League of Nations had no real means of making any effective decision, except to the effect of world opinion, which, let's be honest, is not going to get them anywhere. If a power chose to be defiant, then there was effectively nothing that the League of Nations could do. Brett, 1967. Hey, I got that! 1960. Okay, sorry, I just got excited. So, why did the League of Nations fail? Because it was dumb. I'm going to tell you how. So first of all, the League of Nations was very weak. It didn't have a lot of backing. This can be seen by the fact that America, did not join. They didn't have the backing with this one huge superpower at the time. They were structured very poorly. The Depression at the time limited the fiscal abilities of the nations. It affected them greatly, internally, politically. Unsuccessful. The League was very unsuccessful. They had had a lot of such failures, and they didn't really have any credibility left in them to actually affect any change. The members chose to leave quite often. For instance, Italy and Japan walking out after violating League of Nations covenant rules. I sounded so mad. The big bullies, Germany, Italy, and Japan, were the big bullies in the League of Nations because none of the smaller states could effectively do anything if these three big bullies didn't want to do anything. So they were effectively powerless. Now comes the super important question, the impact of Manchuria on the world. How does Manchuria move the entire world to a global war? I'm going to tell you. First of all, what's going on? Japan is now seen as an expansionist threat, an enemy to the West that need to be isolated internationally, right? Number one. Number two, Hitler now rearms Rhineland in 1936. Number three, Mussolini invades Ethiopia in 1936. He invades Abyssinia in 1953. And Italy leaves the League of Nations in 1937, after again violating its law, just like Japan did. There is an international divided community, and this could be seen with the Asia Monroe Doctrine, which basically Japan was sort of saying, hey, back off, we're expanding here. Road work up ahead, sure hope it does. Sorry. I'm going to take a short little sip of water before I move on to the second Sino-Japanese War, which is so exciting. But before that, we're going to talk about Manchuria's impact on Japan's internal political scene. Interestingly enough, at this time there was a lot of divide in the government. You might have figured with military government, right? So the government had split into two factions. The Kodaha faction, or the Imperial Way faction, and the Toseiha, or the Control faction. So the Kodaha faction, the Imperial Way faction, did not like the existence of zaibatsus, and they wanted a military dictatorship under the emperor. On the other hand, the Toseiha, the Control faction, they believed that privatization, zaibatsus, they brought in a lot of money to the economy. They were essential, and they did like the military, but not as powerful as it, but not under the emperor, with an influence of its own. 1,000 of these faction members took Tokyo and assassinated the prime minister, which came about to be known as the May 15th incident. And the Kodaha, the Imperial Way faction, took part in signing the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936, with Italy and Spain, who joined in 1937. Right, so now let's get into the Second Sino-Japanese War, yay. Okay, first of all, invasion of Manchuria. What does invading Manchuria do? It gives Japan an inroad into China. They're forcing their way in. And the fact that the League of Nations fails to reprimand them for this really just means that Japan can keep doing this and there's going to be no real consequences, right? After which, Japan walks out of the League of Nations. Nobody holds them accountable. You have the Second London Naval Treaty, which Japan, interestingly, does not attend, because that treaty was made to limit a country's naval power. Japan not attending this allows them to keep building their military, allows them to be expansionist. And both of these instances, Manchuria and the treaty, are examples of isolationist walkouts by Japan. Basically, them saying, we're not going to do it because we don't like it. And you know what? Nobody said anything. So, then you had Mengjiang. Mengjiang was a Mongol-led puppet state, which in 1936, under the Japanese command, tried to invade further into China, tried to expand with mobile troops. This failed. However, it showed Japan's clear intent to expand into China. Next up, you have the Second United Front. So by 1937, when the Second Sino-Japanese War happens, the Chinese Civil War comes to an end. Very, very ironically, the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party of China, and the Chinese Communist Party unite. They team up to deter Japan from expanding into China, to keep them out, to say, hey, we're coming together, we want you to stay out. And that's what they do. Jiang, however, is kidnapped by Zhang Xieliang, who is the son of the Manchurian warlord from before, Zhang Xiaolin. However, he is, returned or whatever, negotiated by Zhao Enlai. Right. Anyways, so Marco Polo Bridge incident, Mukden incident, was basically the first time that the international world saw Japan as an aggressor. Right, and it also signaled the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War, because what the Japanese basically did was they bombed this railway, bombed this bridge, and they blamed the Chinese. And really, everybody, international community finds out, it was them. It was you guys. Sorry, you done it. He who smelt it dealt it, and you dealt it. Sorry. Anyways, so the Second United Front is a great instance of showing what the internal political instability in China was at the time, how it was overcome because of a Japanese expansionist threat. The sentiments of the people at the time, they were strongly opposed to the Japanese. It could be described as a conflagration of sentiments against the Japanese. Anyways, sorry. Adding fuel to the fire. Right, okay. Shanghai. So Shanghai being bombed and fighting in Shanghai, again, shows Japan's expansion further in. Nanjing was the event that polarized the entire international community against Japan. And then further Japanese conquest. Basically, Japan had spread their armies sparsely across China. And that was also a great reason as to why they signed the Soviet Neutrality Pact. Basically, because they didn't want to fight the Chinese and the Soviets at the same time. Right. Anyways. So now we move on to... Oh, we're done with that. Right, sorry. So, I feel like I'm missing something. Yeah. What was the effect of the Second Sino-Japanese War on the world? On Japan's international relationships with the world? First of all, the League of Nations. The League of Nations, although it didn't like Japan's actions, they did not want communism in China. They wanted to keep it out. So, because they saw China as being large, chaotic, and corrupt. The Soviet Union were happy because war meant that they could now supply arms to China. They could profit off of that. They helped out by distracting the Japanese and delaying attacks on China. The USA. So the USA wants to reprimand Japan, but they don't want to affect their trade in Asia, and they don't know how to effectively do that. They do, however, prohibit weapons shipments in 1937, a little less isolationist. And in 1938, they lend China $25 million in aid. which was a complete reversal. Like, this is them with isolationism, and this is them flipping over and actually doing something progressive, right? So, table flipped. You know, oh, how the turntables. Right. Germany, they had sort of an awkward stance because while they were anti-communist, they did sign the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939. So, they adhered on that. That was weird. China. So Jiang is finally being more proactive. They start guerrilla warfare, guerrilla attacks against the Japanese. They're blowing up Japanese railways. Bless you. Blowing up Japanese railways. They are attacking, Japanese soldiers, Chinese operators. And okay, then you have the tripartite pact, which was the single one-punch blow to the U.S.'s policy, to foreign policy. They were like, yeah, okay. So the tripartite pact was signed between Germany, Italy, and Japan. Basically, Germany and Italy said, hey, look, we need your support. We're going to keep invading the West. We're going to keep eroding away at that, and we're going to, expand. This is World War II. We're expanding into the West. In the meanwhile, what does Japan get out of giving them support? They get to keep the Western colonies that have now been abandoned in Asia. It's a win-win for all three of them, all three of these fascist jerks. They're like, yes. And this was signed by Yosuke Matsuoka. And again, Yosuke Matsuoka in, I think, 1940, he enters the Soviet Neutrality Pact as well. Right. Now, why was this so important? Why was this the one-punch blow? Because this is what brings about Pearl Harbor. This is what brings about German involvement with the USA in World War II. All right, let's get into it. So basically, why did Japan... This all starts with Japan invading French Indochina. Why did they invade? Because supplies were still coming into Shanxi in China, through Burma, through Laos, through Cambodia, and French Indochina. Building suspense. Okay, so what Japan does is they think, okay, let's cut off these supplies to China. Let's start by taking over French Indochina. Seems harmless enough, except it wasn't. How does the USA respond to them taking over American colonies? French colonies, I'll tell you how. They freeze all of Japan's assets in the US, and they launch, kiss of death, the oil embargo. The economic embargo on oil against Japan in 1941. How does Japan respond? Because what the U.S. has essentially done is they've taken away all their resources to expand, to continue this expansion, to continue this invasion, to continue colonizing. How does Japan respond? First of all, Admiral Yamamoto defeats the Pacific Fleet in the U.S. And now the U.S., it knows that if it doesn't retaliate, Japan is going to amass all of the Dutch East Indies. And you can't let that happen. You can't sit back with a beer and be like, yeah, that's all cool, because it isn't. So now America knows that it needs to be aggressive. This is the final blow. So on December 7th, 1941, Japan launches its naval and air force attack on Pearl Harbor. Surprisingly, without any warning, without any declaration, they just attacked them. And the U.S. is enraged because at the same time, they simultaneously had conversations, peace talks going on to end the economic embargo. And the U.S. is like, I cannot believe you just walked into my house and did that. So, anyways, so now they have all their cards on the table. Japan at the same time also attacks Hong Kong, Singapore, Malay, Philippines, all these colonies close by, right? And they also sink the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. According on President Hara at the time is on statement for saying, it is inevitable that we must start a war against the U.S. Janssen, 2002. Anyways, let's switch back really quickly to Japan's internal political scene. So last we left off, factions. These two factions are closely, very struggly, right? Let me tell you an interesting fact. Between 1931 and 1941, between the Manchurian crisis and Pearl Harbor, Japan had 12 prime ministers in session. What does that tell us? That tells us that there was a superfluous amount of political instability in Japan internally, and that definitely reflected in their foreign policy. The military and the government were not seeing eye to eye, except, of course, with Pearl Harbor. Ugh. Sorry. History joke. Right, so the rape of Nanking, or the Nanjing Massacre, was the single event that polarized the entire international community against Japan. In December of 1937, Chinese inhuman atrocities were committed against Chinese soldiers and civilians in Nanking. The female rape victims ranged to about 30,000. There were about 30,000 fugitive soldiers who were murdered and 12,000 civilians who were killed in the conflict, according to Spence 1990. The rape of Nanking made it all but impossible for Japan to still be accepted as a respectable member of the international community, according to Irie 1987. So, right. Now, while this is happening, what is the USA's response here? Well, let's take a little peek into their isolationist policy. One of the instances of this would be the Stimson Doctrine from 1931 to 37, which basically meant the non-recognition of any treaties that violated China's territorial rights, their administrative integrity, or their sovereignty. All this really meant was, hey, if you do something, look at my lips, I'm saying no, but I'm not really doing anything, so who are you condemning? It's a very isolationist policy. And this brings back into focus the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which Japan signed with around 66 other nations, which basically said, we will use peaceful methods to resolve disputes and not resort to war. Japan doesn't do that. In 1937, interestingly enough, the American public was very, very, very catered towards isolationism. 7 out of 10 Americans did not want to be involved in the Sino-Japanese War. So by 1938, China separated into 3 parts: Nationalist China in Chongqing, Communist China in Shanxi, and East and North being Japanese-dominated China. Interestingly enough, after the Marco Polo Bridge incident and the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japan wanted to reconcile and they wanted to get China on their side, right? So they announced in November of 1938, hey guys, new order in East Asia between Japan, Mexico, and China. We're going to be best pals. China did not like that, so they rejected it. And that brings us to about the end, 1940. Burma Road was closed. Burma Road was like a trade route between British and the Chinese. That brings us to the end. But before that, I'm going to do a quick timeline. Let's get it going. 1853, Commodore Perry comes into Japan, opens trade routes. 1854, the Kanagawa Treaty. 1867, Tokugawa shogunate overthrown, emperor reinstated. 1868, charter oath. 1889, new constitution promulgated. 1894, unequal treaties revisited. First Sino-Japanese War. 1895, the Triple Intervention. 1902, Anglo-Japanese Alliance. 1904, Russo-Japanese War. 1905, the Battle of Tsushima. 1910, annexation of Korea. 1914, capture Shandong. 1915, 21 demands. 1919, Treaty of Versailles. 1921, Washington Conference, 4-Power Treaty. 1922, 9-Power Treaty. 1924, the U.S. bans Japanese immigrants. 1926, Emperor Hirohito comes into power. This birth of nationalism. 1927, the Chinese Civil War. 1930, the First London Naval Treaty. 1931, invasion of Manchuria. 1932, bombings in Shanghai. 1936, the Anti-Combatant Pact, Second London Naval Treaty, and meiji. 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War and Nanjing. 1938, U.S. lends $25 million to China in form of aid. 1939, 1939, Nazi-Soviet Pact, U.S. stops credit. 1941, French Indochina captured Pearl Harbor. And that's been Japan, baby.